It was just 5 elections ago, 16 years ago in 2000, the last time we had a presidential candidate of a major party contesting the initial results. Al Gore would eventually concede to George W. Bush in 2000. Joining us tonight is Republican strategist Ed Pozzuoli, who was on hand there in South Florida, heading up the Bush-Cheney team to monitor the recount vote there in 2000. Ed, good to have you with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Set the table for us here. What happened in 2000? Many of us remember the hanging chads, the recount, the 46 days where Gore held out. Set the table for us and what we could be looking at should Trump try to do the same thing.
Well, I don't know if Trump's trying to do the same thing, but I don't want to make too much of what he said last night. But what I would say, just by historical, the Democratic Party through the Gore campaign challenged the results in 3 specific South Florida counties, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, on varying grounds. Ultimately, they got a hand recount, and each vote that was tallied was counted by canvassing boards per county, and each vote was recounted, but ultimately it did not change the result of the Florida or the state of Florida election going to George Bush.
Now, we know all 3 of those counties did go to Gore's favor, but the overall state vote went to Bush. You said that the Gore campaign challenged the basis of some of these individual ballots. Did they challenge any of them on the basis of voter registration or simply on which candidate was punched?
Well, it was which candidate was punched, and ultimately the legal issue is, can you glean voter intent from the punch card? At the time, the way the system was, there were punch cards, and you'd push out a punch card, the chads, you'd push the chad out, and you'd basically register your vote by running these cards through a computer. Mm-hmm. And ultimately they had to be hand counted. So a group of 3 people, canvassing board, tried to glean voter intent from what was punched out when they examined the individual ballots. It caused a major issues, and that was the last time, and hopefully we'll never face this again. Now, I will share with your audience that the election process here in South Florida and in Florida generally, based on the experience of 2000, has been improved. And so you no longer have manual punch cards, you have more electronic voting. And so there's a little bit more security and protections around trying to glean voter intent, which is the legal standard.
And a lot of Republican local operatives who oversee and manage these elections have even refuted some of Trump's claims that the election process itself is rigged. They're saying the processes, like you're saying, have improved, and that when you go into the ballot, the voting booth, that process is a lot cleaner today than it once was. But isn't Trump's claim more on the voter registration side? It's a long lasting complaint of many Republicans that far too many people, the threshold or the requirement to prove you're a citizen is far too low?
Well, I take Trump's statements as follows. I even take them broader than what you just described. I'm not so sure he's directing his concerns over the actual voting process itself. Where I see his concerns is who gets to vote and why. So when you have people who are not otherwise eligible to vote voting, or when you have, like, say, in the old Chicago days where you have 110% turnout in a precinct, that's problematic, or when you have people who have died still voting somehow on the voting rolls, that clearly is problematic, because what it does is it diminishes everybody's right to vote who correctly and has the authority to vote. It diminishes those vote tallies by adding either votes illegally or unlawfully or through corrupt practices. It diminishes and waters down the actual rightful votes being cast.
For the last 2 weeks plus now on the campaign trail, we've heard Donald Trump at different campaign rallies advising many of his own supporters in the audience to be on the lookout, keep an open eye, watch the polls. Not exactly sure what he's asking them to watch for. Perhaps it's who he's asking them to watch for. As a strategist, would you ever advise a candidate to take this approach?
Well, no, but the campaign, it's always been a function of both sides' campaigns to ensure that their voters get to vote. And voter integrity is important. So it is important that the processes of voting we keep those with fidelity so that people who have the right to vote get to vote, and those who do not do not. The right to vote comes with responsibilities. So some of those things are being able to fill out the ballot and being able to submit the ballot timely and being able to register to vote in a timely fashion. And so all of those rights come with a set of responsibilities. That's what you're hearing mostly from Republicans. The other side of it is that there are many ways to vote now. You can vote absentee or by mail. You can vote prior to, in Florida, early voting actually starts Monday, October 24th. And so what you're going to have is you're going to have a 2-week period actually before Election Day where people have already cast ballots. In fact, as of this morning, there was some 800,000 votes already cast. They haven't been tallied yet, but already cast in Florida.
A lot of the buzz coming out of last night's debate was about the claim that Donald Trump, or the refusal Donald Trump made to claim there on the stage that he would accept the outcome. And that's, of course, setting the table for much of the conversation that we're having here today. But it seems that there have been several moderators or different news anchors or journalists who have tried throughout this process to pin Trump into a corner and get him to commit if you lose. We remember this from the first Fox debate when Megyn Kelly asked all the candidates on stage to make a pledge to support the eventual nominee or the winner, basically saying if you're a loser, raise your hand and say you'll be a good loser. Trump's had a hard time with that, hasn't he?
No, I actually think, look, you don't know what's going to happen on Election Day. You don't know if there's a tremendous irregularity with the voting process. Let's just say as a more innocent process. Let's say in a major Republican area like Jacksonville, Florida, as an example, who was subject to the hurricane. Let's say they lost power and people couldn't vote for hours and hours. That would be an irregularity that would have to be dealt with. And if that wasn't dealt with appropriately or accommodations weren't made to allow those people to vote. So what you're asking Trump to do is to commit to being, and you're saying, in the eventuality, if he loses, to accept whatever the results are under any circumstances. I'm not so sure any candidate should do that. And certainly in 2000, Al Gore didn't do that.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of people are saying that any candidate should say that ultimately I will submit to the democratic process of the election. Some of Trump's supporters are coming to his defense saying we're not so sure he's not doing that. He's just a deal maker, a consummate negotiator who says I will if you abide by the rules of the contract. But if not, if there's foul play, then I reserve my rights. And that's more of the nuanced argument he didn't actually articulate last night, but some are trying to make that case for him.
It's actually a shame that because this has become such a news story. I actually think that that's exactly the point, that if the election goes off without a hitch and there's no real controversy around the election process, and that we don't have major controversy, then there's no reason for him not to accept the result, whether he wins or loses.
But then again, he is also putting out there what you might consider a self-fulfilling prophecy, saying for weeks that it's rigged, it's already rigged, the media is rigging it, the DOJ is rigging it, the voting booths, the polls themselves are rigged. So he's telling people to look for something, and that if you lead a horse to water, sometimes they're looking for something to validate their suspicions.
But that discussion around what he thinks is rigged he's talking about Washington and the process. He's just not talking about the election process, the actual physical election process. He's talking about that the media is against him as a Republican, as an example, and not holding Hillary Clinton to the same standard. That the DOJ and the FBI did not hold Hillary Clinton to the same standard. That many soldiers, many servicemen, and others who committed far less atrocities around emails and secret and confidential information have been far punished for it for far less things than she's admitted to. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of those things that go to why it's a rigged system. She is the establishment candidate. He is the anti-establishment candidate. So given that, when the establishment lines up behind their candidate, Hillary Clinton in this case, clearly they have some advantage of being the establishment. That's what I think he's addressing those rigged comments to.
Yeah, and with less than 3 weeks to go before election night, we do know that this is going to break down into battleground states, perhaps none of them bigger than Florida. Donald Trump's road to victory probably cannot progress unless he wins Florida. It is absolutely a do or die, a must-win state. Debates draw huge audiences, but those are all done now. So where do the campaigns go from here? Do they target specific states? What's the strategy from here until November 8th?
Well, I think you heard some of Trump's strategies. So as an example, he illustrated or at least drove home this pay-for-play idea around the Clinton Foundation, which Hillary Clinton didn't answer, but he specifically mentioned Haiti and the large Haitian community that sits in Miami-Dade County. That's a large voting bloc, or at least a substantial one, that usually votes Democratic, but in this case, he has some support in that community because of the community's feelings around the Clintons and their involvement in Haiti not being on the up and up. Whether that's true or not, that is the perception in that community. So clearly that's one. The second piece is just recently he came out and he talked about the Castro in Cuba and why the deal that President Obama has made is so bad, and why we should demand human rights concessions by the Cuban government and a more democratization or a move to democratization of that socialist state. Again, he is speaking to a strong base of Cuban voters in Miami-Dade County. There are others. They have been here in Broward. They have been in Palm Beach. They have been in Republican strongholds in Central and North Florida. And these are things that he's going to have to do to move the needle. Florida is going to be close regardless. And so because of the nature of the state, it's a huge state. It's an expensive state to campaign in, and it's going to be close. But you're right when you say he must win Florida.
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying he's expecting to win some of the central parts of the state. Perhaps the first district will almost certainly go Trump. You have a lot of the more rural parts, but it seems like he's focusing on South Florida in particular to break up the voting blocks that have traditionally gone Democrat.
Well, I mean, look, in any statewide election, whether it's governor or in this case the electoral votes for president, South Florida, Broward and Palm Beach particularly, and some Miami-Dade is where Republicans can lose the race. They can't win it in South Florida, but they can certainly lose it. Mm-hmm. And so what you want to do is mitigate the vote totals here. You want to try to keep it as close as possible and make it up as you go north, up I-95 or up I-75 on the west coast of Florida.
There's one last thing I want to ask you about strategy-wise before we let you go tonight. It's a new slogan Donald Trump has laid out. It's Drain the Swamp. We've seen this hashtag on Trump's social media pages. The whole promise he just recently unveiled earlier this week was that he would impose new term limits. He would impose new 5-year bans on politicians leaving Washington, becoming part of the revolving door to go get paid as lobbyists representing special interests. He calls it Drain the Swamp. Get rid of all of the different perceptions of corruption or the reality of corruption and influence in Washington, D.C. How well is that playing currently, and how well do you expect that particular message, that part of his campaign to play out, and will it move the needle before November 8th?
So I think it does have the possibility of really moving the needle. It is consistent with his narrative as the anti-establishment candidate. It takes the anti-establishment rhetoric beyond rhetoric. It goes to specific issues in which you can impact the culture and the distrust that people have of Washington. And I think that it's about time. It also plays into the narrative about the Clintons somehow living, for 30 years as alleged public servants, but somehow having no money some time ago and now being very, very wealthy, some $200 million estimated net worth. How did that happen? Through public service? I'm not so sure. But in this case, what you have is congressmen and women going up there and becoming career politicians. And then when it's time for them to step out of Congress, they get a nice cushy lobbying job. And both of these things, both term limits and at least a 5-year ban, breaks the cycle of the insider nature of Washington. I do think that speaks loud and clear to him being the anti-establishment candidate.
Yeah,
yes.
it took John Boehner less than 6 months to accomplish just that, leaving as the Speaker of the House, and he's already picked up several gigs. One of them, a tobacco company he's representing, and a PR firm there. A guy like Trent Lott took him less time after leaving Washington to pick up some of these gigs. And this is an argument that some of the liberal and more progressive strategists have told me off the record, and they won't say it publicly because they know that there's an election to win right now, but they've even said this is something very appealing to them as well. They want to cut down on the corruption and the lobbying that goes on in Washington. So for some of the steady-minded, policy-based voters, even the ones that are considering Hillary Clinton, this might be an appeal to them as well.
Well, remember, you had an anti-establishment movement on both sides. On the Republican side, obviously, through the nomination of Donald Trump, but you had a strong challenge from what basically was an obscure socialist senator from Vermont Bernie Sanders running against Hillary Clinton and giving her just about everything she could possibly handle in the nomination process. And that really is, he was the direct reflection on the left of the same anti-establishment fervor that you're seeing on the right through Donald Trump.
Of course, he's now publicly endorsing Hillary Clinton's bid, so there's some question as to whether or not his supporters will be more loyal to the personality of Bernie Sanders or the principles of the Progressive Party or the Progressive Movement as well. And Donald Trump is certainly giving them something to think about, at least when it comes to lobbying in Congress. That's all the time we have for tonight. Ed Pozzuoli joining us from Fort Lauderdale. Ed, thanks so much.
Thank you.